My name's Michael Wesley. I'm the Director of Academic Outreach and Research at the National Security College, and it's a delight to have you all here. Before we get started, we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. China is the biggest question that we face in this region and indeed the world. The choices that China makes, the way that China develops in the years and the decades ahead will be, I believe, the single biggest influencer of the outcome of the future for this country and our region. And so it's an enormous pleasure to invite one of this country's foremost China foreign policy analyst, Linda Jakobson, to speak at this National Security Lecture tonight. It's a great pleasure because Linda is someone whose work and whose views I admire enormously, and she is also a close personal friend. She is the East Asia Program Director at the Lowy Institute. Before she joined the Lowy Institute in 2011, she lived and worked in China for 20 years. She's published 6 books about China and East Asian societies on topics as diverse as Confucianism and reform. She is a Mandarin speaker and has published extensively on China's foreign and security policy, the Taiwan Strait, China's energy security, climate change, and science and technology policies. Prior to joining the Lowy Institute, she served as the Director of the China and Global Security Program and Senior Researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. Between 1998 and 2009, she worked for the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. She was a Fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University in 1990. The Finnish edition of her book, A Million Truths, A Decade in China, won the Finnish Government Publication Award. Her SIPRI policy paper, New Foreign Policy Actors in China, a truly revolutionary piece of work which I commend to all of you, was awarded an Alibi in 2010. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Linda Jakobson.
Thank you, Michael, for that very generous introduction. Thank you to two Michaels, Michael Lestrange and also Michael Wesley, for the invitation to speak tonight. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here at the National Security College. And it's my first public lecture in Canberra, though I've now been exactly 2 years in Australia. So a first for me. I've divided my presentation tonight into 3 parts, hoping that it might a little bit shed light on China's foreign policy dilemma. The first question I'm going to talk about is, why is it so difficult for us outsiders to understand China's foreign policy? And the second question is, what are the objectives of China's foreign policy? And thirdly then, to the short term, what are the near-term biggest challenges in foreign policy for China? So first to this question, why is it so difficult for us outsiders to understand China's foreign policy? I think we all recognize how important understanding the foreign policy of China is to the world. As Michael already mentioned, it's one of the biggest questions that confront us, how China, as a major economical, political, military power, is going to shape the region, how it's going to use its power. And of course, today its global outreach stretches to just about every corner of the globe. We never feel that we really get it when we think about China's foreign policy. In fact, we're often mostly confused by what they call their foreign policy. And I think there are several reasons, and I'll go through them one by one. Firstly, despite all the changes that have taken place in China today, we should never forget that decision-making in China remains opaque. The country is far more open than it was just 10 years ago, but still, the pivotal decisions in China are made by the Politburo Standing Committee, the all-powerful group of 7 men. There's no public information about when they meet, and let alone what they have decided at these meetings. I like to say that here in Australia, or in any country which calls itself a democracy, we are comfortable saying that China has a great impact on our economic well-being. We'll go as far as to say that we're quite dependent on China's economic growth continuing. But we find it rather uncomfortable to say that our well-being, our prosperity, is dependent on decisions made by 7 men of the Chinese Communist Party who make decisions without any transparency or accountability, except perhaps to each other. And above, just to add insult to injury, they profess to believe in Marxist-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. We don't like those kind of truths. The second reason why we're often confused by China's foreign policy is that today there are so many more actors who try and influence Chinese foreign policy than there were 5 to 10 years ago. Michael mentioned the report that I wrote while I was still at CIPRI called The New Foreign Policy Actors of China. In that report, I describe that the diversification of Chinese society on the one hand, coupled with the intense internationalization of China on the other hand, has led to numerous groups, both within the official establishment of China and also groups on the margins of that establishment wanting to, striving to influence foreign policy decision-making. So they are the official actors, party organs, government ministries, PLA units. They're the official foreign policy actors, and there's many more of them today because of China's global outreach than there were 5 to 10 years ago. And then there are these actors on the margins. In that report, I identify 4 very important actors on the margins. They are the CEOs of large resource companies, especially the oil and gas companies. They are the provincial leaders in provinces which are along the coast, those that have prospered the most from economic changes in China. They are the netizens who are increasingly forceful in their opinions about what Chinese foreign policy should look like, and sometimes do indeed have an impact on decision-making. And then the 4th group is a group I call the intellectuals who have, for one reason or another, some connection to the top leaders. They too today are more and more influential. In that report, I identify 3 trends, and I'll just briefly, with one sentence, explain them. First of all, decision-making, even in foreign policy formulation, has become fractured in China. Secondly, though no group questions that China must continue to open up, must continue to reform, there are certainly different interpretations about what degree of internationalization China should pursue. And thirdly, which is most pertinent for this evening's discussion about China's foreign policy dilemma, there are an increasing number of actors who would like to see China be more assertive in its foreign and security policy. Now, I wrote that report 3 years ago. These trends have all continued in the last 3 years, and based on research I've done over the past 3 years, I'd say this third factor, the fact that before it was more groups on the margins who were advocating for China to taking a more staunch stance when it came to dealing with the United States or China's neighbors. Today, that's a growing trend, it's a strengthening trend, and I'll get back to that as I move forward. Then thirdly, one of the reasons that we are confused and have a difficult time understanding Chinese foreign policy is that the people who actually run Chinese foreign policy affairs on a day-to-day basis are not powerful leaders of the Communist Party. Now, there's a contradiction there. We think China's foreign policy is extremely important, But if you look at the party status of the men who are in charge of foreign policy today in China, they are merely members of the third most powerful group of Chinese Communist Party members. So at the very top, you have the 7 Politburo Standing Committee members, then you have the 20-plus Politburo, the enlarged Politburo, and under them, the third tier of the power structure is the Central Committee, which has 200 members. Now, the man in charge, the state counselor, he's called, in charge of foreign affairs, he's merely a Central Committee member. So is the foreign minister. And they can be outweighed in any discussion, outranked in any protocol by any of the 20 Politburo members. So they are not powerful party members. And in China, the party is the place that wields power. Now, pivotal foreign policy decisions are made then by the Politburo Standing Committee, this 7-member small committee which is headed by Xi Jinping. Certainly, Xi Jinping and his 6 fellow colleagues are much more experienced in foreign policy than their predecessors were 10 years ago. There's no doubt that they've been groomed also in the realm of foreign policy. Xi will be the one who makes the final decisions on any really controversial foreign policy issue. On issues that deal with the United States, he'll be certainly assisted by Wang Qishan, who's on the Politburo Standing Committee. The new premier, the number 2 now in the party hierarchy, Li Keqiang, will be mostly responsible for decisions about Europe. And Zhang Dejiang, who, by the way, is the only Politburo Standing Committee member who has ever lived abroad. He's lived in Pyongyang for 1 year. He will be, I think, pivotal when we come to North Korea. Now, I mentioned this about Zhang Dejiang not only to get everyone to smile a little. I say it because there's certainly a disconnect between China's leaders, the very top leaders, and vast groups of elites in China today. One can say there have been millions and millions of Chinese over the last 30 years who have lived abroad, studied abroad, worked abroad. And so it's interesting that the 7 men who lead China, who are the most powerful in China, have this gap in perception of the outside world and of the West in particular, compared to so many elites who have spent at least a year abroad during their lifetime. And then finally, the fourth reason why Chinese foreign policy is sometimes so confusing is because, as I've mentioned already in my previous point, foreign policy is not a top priority for China's leaders. It's domestic problems, immense challenges that China's leaders have, which preoccupies them. They simply have to concentrate on keeping economic growth going to stay in power. This is a prerequisite for the Chinese Communist Party to stay in power. So foreign policy is not what Xi Jinping thinks about when he wakes up every morning. It's much more questions of how to keep the economy growing, or how to decrease severe air and water pollution, how to increase social welfare, how to create jobs, how to decrease the social injustices in society which cause so much dissatisfaction. Xi has about 5 years, the first term that he will be General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, to make progress on these domestic reforms. Chinese people themselves are extremely worried about the future of their country. This is something that often doesn't come out in a lot of analysis of China today. Chinese elites during the last 12 to 18 months, and I go back to China very regularly, are fixated with the question of how are we going to move forward? How are we going to deal with these immense challenges? How is Xi Jinping going to muster the political will to deal with financial restructuring, creating jobs, and so on? So they're quite worried about the future, while we, from the outside, see this rising giant and worry about how China is going to use its power. But from the inside, China actually, or Chinese people, perceive China at the moment to being quite weak. And of course, this disconnect between how we perceive China and how they themselves perceive themselves is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to always understand China's foreign policy. Then to the next part of my talk tonight, and that was the question of what, after all, are the objectives of China's foreign policy. Officially, these objectives have been stated in several official documents. The Communist Party sees as the goals of foreign policy to, one, ensure that the party stays in power. They say the job is to ensure political stability, but when asked to explain that, it is very explicitly said that the aim of China's diplomacy and foreign policy is to keep the Chinese Communist Party in power. Secondly, it should defend sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as seek to reunify the motherland, which is a reference to Taiwan and the reunification of the mainland and Taiwan. And thirdly, to ensure economic development. I think the second objective, to defend sovereignty and territorial integrity, is what we have seen China pursue much more assertively during the last 3 to 4 years. We will continue to see China assertively defend sovereignty, or what at least China perceives as its sovereign territory. And hopefully, if time allows at the end of my talk, I could go into the question of core interests, which has been a focus at least of international media over the last few weeks. What, after all, is a core interest of China? How does China itself define it? And is, for example, the South China Sea or the East China Sea a core interest for China? Obviously, these three officially stated objectives are somewhat ambiguous. I think they're intended to be. And of course, obviously, they're sometimes in conflict with each other. And hence, the confusion over what China is actually hoping to achieve with its foreign policy actions. An unstated but very important underlying objective of China's foreign policy is to ensure that China returns to its rightful place at the center of the world as a great nation which is respected and bestowed dignity by others. One has to remember that, after all, the Communist Party came to power in 1949, vowing that China will never again be subjugated and humiliated by foreigners. And today, it's not only school children who are taught this. Citizens, adults, are reminded of this just about every month by a new book, by a new article, by a new museum exhibition, a theme park, a theater play, and so on. All of these describe the suffering of the Chinese people at the hands of the Japanese and Westerners during the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s. So China continues to crave respect today. Many Chinese officials who I've spoken to over the last 5 to 8 years continuously say that they're disappointed that China's contributions over the last 30 years, the reform period, contributions to global prosperity and also stability, are never acknowledged sufficiently by outsiders. Yet again, another disconnect. Chinese officials often feel we, the outsiders, don't show enough acknowledgement, they mean gratitude, for what China has done to keep the economy going and to keep the region stable. This brings me very briefly to the concept of China Dream. Xi Jinping has now coined this notion. He's repeatedly used the China Dream in many of his speeches. It's this aspiration of restoring national dignity after the century of national humiliation, and he's put it into these two words, China Dream. Basically, I think one can say the concept signifies the need to continue to modernize China, the need for China to continue to regain its national comprehensive strength, which is a very Chinese concept, but that's what they say about their own power, its national comprehensive strength. This concept of rejuvenation is, of course, by no means new, but it's come alive again because Xi has spoken about it so many times. It's a very colloquial expression, obviously much easier for a lot of people to comprehend and understand than, for example, the three represents of Jiang Zemin. And he made it very clear that this would be his slogan, because already on the very first day after he had become General Secretary, after the closing of the 18th National Party Congress in November, he took his fellow Politburo Standing Committee members to the National Museum in Beijing, and they visited the exhibition Road to Revival, and he spoke there about the China Dream. Hopefully in the Q&A we're going to have some more time to discuss this China Dream, because it's an intricate part of, at the moment, what one would say, the Chinese psyche. And then lastly, to the question of the short-term challenges that China today faces, China's short-term foreign policy challenges. I named four of them: relations with the United States, relations with Japan, relations with Southeast Asian countries, especially those which China today has sovereignty disputes over in the South China Sea, and then North Korea. Not only, of course, Beijing's relations with Pyongyang, but the whole North Korean nuclear program and the Korean Peninsula dilemma, which has been troubling Beijing, Tokyo, Seoul, and Washington for at least the last 2 decades. First, to the question of China's relations with the United States. The media likes to always tell us how much strategic distrust there is between these two giants. Certainly, there is an ample amount of that. But barring a blow-up over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, which I'll come to, in the East China Sea, I think that Xi will do his utmost to pursue constructive relations with Washington. These two countries are highly interdependent. It's in the interest of both countries, certainly also Obama, for this relationship to continue in a constructive manner. The relationship is also today much more mature than it was just 5 to 10 years ago. I'll give you 2 examples. A year ago, we had 2 crises. The first one was Bo Xilai's police chief escaping to the consulate of the United States, asking for political asylum when he had fallen out with Bo Xilai. Now we know the disgraced Chongqing party chief. This happened on the eve of then Vice President Xi Jinping's very important trip to the United States. The fact that this was somehow dealt with and didn't cause any interruption to Xi Jinping's visit to the United States, but also didn't really cause any tensions between China and the United States, is a sign, in my opinion, of the maturity of the relations, on how far the two countries have come to dealing with these sudden incidents which could turn into a crisis in a flash. The second example is the flight of the blind activist Chen, who went to the US Embassy in Beijing. This was on the eve of the strategic dialogue between the United States and China. Hillary Clinton was just about to arrive in Beijing, a very important moment in the relationship. Again, the two countries were able to deal with this incident in a way that didn't in any way damage the relationship. So there is a maturity which I'm cautiously optimistic about, and I do think that the interdependence between the two countries is often overlooked when we talk about the strategic distrust. Now, what's going to happen 20 to 30 years down the line is not something that I'm now referring to. I don't think any of us should even try and predict what's going to happen 20 to 30 years down the line, because it's impossible to predict what kind of a power China is going to develop into and how China will deal with these domestic challenges, which I briefly mentioned earlier on. Then coming to the relationship between China and Japan, as we know, last September, the so-called Senkaku Diaoyu Island dispute flared up again. Why? Because the Japanese central government decided to buy off the private owner 3 of the disputed islands. This caused widespread protests all over China. Japanese citizens were beaten up, Japanese businesses were attacked. It was really quite an ugly scene. There was a real outburst of nationalism, obviously with the quiet blessing of the leadership, because one doesn't demonstrate in China for that many weeks without the blessing of the Communist Party. Now, recently I've been reading analysis by Westerners who put the entire blame of tensions increasing, escalating on China. This is a dispute where there are 2 guilty parties. Both parties are guilty to the escalation of tension. Japan chose to purchase, the Japanese government chose to purchase the islands at a very sensitive time for China. If they had only asked the private owner, given him a bit more money, to put off the official announcement of the deal to March of this year, it would have still caused an eruption of tensions, but it wouldn't have, I think at least, caused the crisis that we see as an ongoing crisis at the moment between China and Japan. Everyone knows that the months leading up to a leadership transition in China are very sensitive, and it was a very inappropriate time to purchase the islands. Now, the Japanese government, for its part, was actually just trying to stop an ultra-nationalistic Tokyo governor from purchasing those islands and thinking it was doing a good deed. But the timing was most unfortunate, and very interestingly, the Prime Minister of Japan at the time, Noda, has acknowledged that the timing could have been better. Well, we have escalated tensions. We have law enforcement agency vessels and aircraft nearly on a daily basis today patrolling these disputed islands. Why? Japan does not acknowledge that these islands are disputed. End of story. They do not acknowledge that there is any dispute. China, again, sees them as disputed territory and sees that the central government of Japan changed the status quo which was really agreed upon 32 years ago when China and Japan established diplomatic relations, that let this issue be. We won't touch it, we'll leave it to future generations, and that's how we're going to manage the disputed islands. So this change in status quo in the eyes of Beijing was very serious, and now they feel that they need to assert sovereignty, and that's why they send their law enforcement vessels out to the area. That's why Japan, of course, understandably also responds by sending its own. The risk of an incident is extremely high. An incident could easily spiral out of control, causing a real crisis. For my part, I am cautiously optimistic that both Xi and Prime Minister Abe want to avoid at any cost this crisis, because it is an ongoing crisis, one can say, as long as these 2 countries send their patrol boats out and their aircraft out to survey the islands. They really want to see this crisis managed in a way that would not escalate to, for example, armed conflict. I think the interdependence also between China and Japan is a huge factor here, not only for Japan, but also for China. Japanese companies employ hundreds of thousands of Chinese workers. I think that both leaders are well aware of the risks involved of this crisis getting out of hand. How it's going to be resolved, I cannot say, but certainly this is a real test for Xi Jinping. He cannot look weak. He cannot give in to Japan, nor can Abe. Abe cannot look weak either. And for Xi Jinping, now as the new Communist Party leader, any move that would be seen as a concession to Japan means that he is not standing up as a dignified Communist Party leader. So that's certainly going to be a tightrope, which is probably one of the most crucial that he'll have to walk in the next 18 to 24 months. The same pertains, of course, to the South China Sea. There, as I have written in a recent Lowy Institute analysis, I see the weaker countries of Philippines and Vietnam being in a very difficult position to fend off China's assertiveness. Here we're really talking about a giant against smaller, weaker parties. The economic damage that a confined military conflict would inflict upon China if there was a military conflict between the Philippines and China or Vietnam and China would be much smaller to China than, for example, a conflict with Japan. And that's why I am worried that if Xi Jinping is put against the wall to show his nationalist credentials, it would be in the South China Sea that he would show force. Xi Jinping could also surprise us all and agree to multilateral negotiations, even if he dragged them on forever and ever, but at least to agree to the principle of finding a way to manage the disputes over the South China Sea. They're sovereignty disputes. They concern these islands around which there are known both oil, gas, and other mineral resources. He hasn't given any indication that he would do this. It would be a game changer in the South China Sea. But I do think that China is very aware of the damage it has done to itself over the last 3 to 4 years in Southeast Asia. After all, over 15 years, with very skillful diplomacy, they built up good relations with just about every Southeast Asian country. And this goodwill has all but vanished because of the assertive behavior, mostly of the law enforcement agencies in China. So I think we're going to see Xi Jinping putting effort into Southeast Asia and restarting, so to speak, a diplomatic charm offensive. And then lastly, North Korea. I like to begin anything I say about North Korea with the statement that no one knows what's going on in North Korea. And anyone who tells you that they do is lying. We don't know what's going on in North Korea. The Chinese are extremely exasperated, and they, if anyone, have had a lot of dealings over the decades with the North Koreans. I think for China, the principle of no war, no instability, and no nukes, this has been their mantra for a number of years now, will hold. I belong to the camp, if you've been following this issue, that does not see a fundamental change in China's policies towards North Korea. What does this mean? No war, no instability, no nukes? It means that, yes, they don't want nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula, but it's only number 3 in priority. The second one, no instability, still overrides the concern about nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. China has a lot to lose, at least in the eyes of Beijing, if there would be serious instability in North Korea, if there were tens of millions of people dislocated because of a collapse of the North Korean regime. China rightfully asks, why shouldn't South Korea turn off the taps? Now, South Korea doesn't supply fuel to North Korea like the Chinese do, which is the pivotal card in Beijing's hand, but they do provide aid, they do provide money, and they've, until last week, had a very, for the North Koreans, lucrative joint venture going on at Kaesong. So I don't see, though in the last couple of months we've seen some analysis to that extent, a real change in China's position towards North Korea. They will continue to somehow balance between the expectations of their neighbors and the United States to put pressure on Pyongyang. They will continue to put pressure, but I don't see them cutting off, for example, fuel and causing a collapse of the North Korean regime. I think the fear of instability is ingrained in Chinese leaders. Quite a few of the Standing Committee members at present have served in Northeast China. They've been part of that contingency plan making if North Korea regime collapses and there are millions of refugees coming over the border. I don't think they're going to easily be swayed by Xi Jinping, even if he was of that opinion that China is going to get seriously tough with North Korea. I think we are going to have this problem around for a long, long time to come. Now, in conclusion, China's foreign policy, as I view it, will not become proactive. It will continue to be reactive, as it has been already for some years now. I think a genuine concern that I have is that inattention to foreign policy by the top leaders could lead to a crisis occurring due to the actions of numerous foreign policy actors. And in this case, of course, I mean official foreign policy actors. There are, as I already mentioned, numerous groupings within the establishment and certainly outside the establishment who would like to see China take a much more forceful stance, who are of the opinion that for 30 years now, during the whole reform period, China has always swallowed and agreed to the terms that have been given to them by the United States and others. And now China has shown it's a responsible power during the global financial crisis especially, and China should be setting the terms of engagement. China should be setting the agenda. I think this is a China we're going to see in the short term, balancing between its desperate need to have a benign, peaceful environment, but at the same time managing the expectations of the elites that are pushing Xi Jinping and his fellow leaders to a much more forceful Chinese foreign policy. Thank you.
Linda, thank you. A huge amount to digest and mull over there. Ladies and gentlemen, we have about 20 minutes for some questions and answers. I might start things off, Linda, by pressing you a little bit on core interests. You made mention of
I didn't get back to it.
Could you tell us a little bit about what China means when it talks about core interests?
And thank you for reminding me. I was looking at the clock and I knew I had to stop, but I did promise to get back to this question of core interests. And of course, it's been in the papers recently because the foreign ministry spokesperson blurted out that, of course, this is not a direct quote, but I'm paraphrasing, of course the Diaoyu Islands are part of China's core interests. And every China watcher from every part of the globe went ballistic and said, oh, so now it's official. The Diaoyu are part of China's core interests. It is true, she said so, you can go and look at the YouTube, but the official transcription of the press conference had omitted this sentence. So let me state that Diaoyu have not been declared a core interest of China. I think it was a human error. As I've said to a few other people who have asked me this, I mean, how many times has the White House press spokesman had to retract something that he or she said? I mean, human beings answer questions perhaps a little unofficially, and she blurted this out, meaning that the Diaoyu is sovereign territory of China, and protecting sovereignty is, of course, a core interest. So, I mean, I don't think China has changed its core interests from the ones I mentioned: keeping the party in power, protecting sovereignty, and ensuring economic development. But as I said, they're very ambiguous and, of course, sometimes in tension with each other. But having said that, because of the diversification of Chinese society, not only have the numbers of actors increased immensely, but also what you're allowed to write about, discuss, debate, even in the open source domain. So there are lots of elites who have their own spokespeople in researchers, in media representatives, sometimes even in public intellectuals who are pressing the government to define sovereignty issues in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea, the Diaoyu-Senkaku dispute, as a core interest. And some of them are quite influential. In fact, PLA uniformed officers have said that they should be a core interest. So it confuses us when this one-party state, which supposedly is run by one party, the Communist Party, suddenly allows all this discussion, influential, authoritative people saying things that are not in the party doctrine. But the work report of the Party Congress in November makes it very clear that those are the three core interests. And I'd add to that Wang Jise of Beijing University, who I hold very high in my thoughts when I think about strategic thinkers who are influential, who have access to the top leadership. He wrote in Foreign Affairs in March, April 2011 that besides the Taiwan question, China has never defined any foreign policy issue as a core interest. And he very much, in an interesting way, specifies how keeping the party in power is the core interest.
Mr. Jakobson, there's a question here to me about tactics, but I mean, China seems to have gone out of its way to annoy virtually every actor it has a relationship with. You know, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan, India. Surely tactically, if they were wise, you might have this end state of the same thing, but take them one at a time, you know, gang up on them with other people. Why is it so tactically inept?
What happened starting at the end of 2009 could be summed up colloquially by what you said. China went out of its way to annoy one country after the other. And I'm just going to fast reverse us back to November 2009. From China's point of view, the Obama first visit to China as President of the United States was extremely successful. They managed to get the United States to sign a document where it said that the United States should respect China's core interests. So we come back to this question of core interests. This was a real diplomatic victory for China. I might add the United States has certainly regretted that statement since. But it was also at the time, just remember where we were with the global financial crisis. China, it came to the realization that, my God, the world really does need us and we should show our power. But at the same time, it's not that linear here. I think there was a lot of inattention by the senior leadership, which has now slightly shown signs of changing under Xi Jinping with the restructuring of the government which took place at the National People's Congress in March, and I can come back to that, but I think he's very aware of the inattention by the senior leadership, and there was a lot of actions by these foreign policy actors, especially in the realm of maritime security, in which they didn't break any rules and they didn't certainly defy any orders, but Chinese language per se is very inaccurate, and directives that come from the central to the provinces and lower are very vague, to say the least. So one can nearly justify any action under the, for example, banner of protecting national sovereignty. These actors at the local level did a lot of harm to China's international reputation, diplomatic efforts in Southeast Asia, like I mentioned, by being party to many of these maritime incidents. So at least part of China kicking itself in the shins can be explained, in my opinion, in those days by a degree of inattention from the senior leadership. Now, as I mentioned, Xi Jinping, by blessing the restructuring of the government 3 months ago and putting all of these maritime law enforcement agencies under one command, we don't yet know is it under one command. We know that they have been put under the administration of one agency, but it remains to be seen are the fleets actually under one command. I think there is an acknowledgement by the top leadership that inattention is a recipe for disaster. And they do need to pay more attention. But winding themselves out of this without looking weak, without in any way showing that others are putting pressure on China to change their policies, is a real balancing act, like I said. And if I may, I'll just give one example which hasn't been written about. Last year, suddenly there was an outcry from the Philippines and Vietnam that new passports that were being carried by Chinese PRC citizens had a map with the disputed territory as China's territory. And well, for understandable reasons, this caused a great outcry throughout Southeast Asia. Well, I started looking into this, and it so happens it's the Public Security Ministry which issues passports. They had not not only consulted, they had not even informed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs about this. I have 3 sources who said that the Foreign Minister, Yang Jiechi, at the time was furious when he heard about it. Official passports are issued by the Foreign Ministry. So officials traveling do not have that controversial map in their passport, but normal citizens continue to have that. Now, what could Xi Jinping do in that situation? Say that this was a mistake, that it's not our sovereign territory? Well, China has always said that everything inside the 9-dashed line is their sovereign territory. So to revoke a decision by a ministry or a provincial government or a municipal government is much more tricky than, of course, trying to get it never to happen in the first place. But that's the inefficiency of the Chinese bureaucracy, that they have very little communication, and they are different actors pursuing their own interests. They have competing agendas, many of these ministries.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. China's obviously a critical partner in our economic relationships. And if we go back a couple of years to the case of Stern Hu, it seems that Australia and China were talking past each other on what constitutes national security and what constitutes other elements of business intelligence collection and so on. What lessons do you draw out of the Stern Hu case and related cases which might have an impact on our future economic relations with China?
It's a very good question. I'll immediately say that I don't think I'm qualified to go into every detail of the Stern Hu case, as I wasn't yet living in Australia and didn't work for an Australian think tank. But one of the lessons I think that both sides should have taken away, and in part have taken away, is that if you don't have dialogue, you don't have communication at the very senior levels, if there's not that much familiarity between the CEOs of companies or the political leaders of countries, when something like that happens, that they can pick up the phone and discuss, or fly to meet each other and discuss, then it is really a downward spiral. I think at least at the company level, because I've had many discussions with Rio Tinto since, this has been acknowledged, that there has to be a lot of communication, and I'd like to add the word trust in dealings between 2 counterparts, but also at the government level. One has to get to know one's counterpart. I'm not saying you have to agree with what the Chinese say or do, but one has to know them well enough that one can have those discussions when problems arise. And problems inevitably will arise, even in the economic relationship, as Australia has seen.
Hello, Professor, and thank you for a very clear and concise presentation. I'm Kin Yi from the Singapore High Commission. I'm just wondering, in 2009, when Australia released its Defence White Paper, there was some concern from China that the paper was antagonistic towards China. Do you think that the recent White Paper that was released has gone some way to alleviate that concern? Thank you.
Certainly, I think the wording in the most recent Defence White Paper of Australia is different in tone than the one of 2009. I think the Chinese, quite understandably, and if I've understood correctly, rightfully, thought that they were the target in 2009. I've always advocated that one should say out loud that there is uncertainty how China will use its power. And uncertainty evokes anxiety, and sometimes anxiety invokes fears. And it's normal that we don't know how China will use its power in the future, because China doesn't know itself. I think it would be much better to openly discuss this fundamental issue. So I think the recent Defence White Paper did take a few steps, at least. I haven't read it word for word. I have to admit I've been ill and my voice is going. But I have read a lot of the commentary around it in some of the government official statements since Friday. And I think there has been a step taken to acknowledging that these are questions that need to be discussed, and so it should be. So yes, I think the tone of this recent Defense White Paper has certainly probably been a positive for Beijing.
And the lady on the end of the row there.
Hi, Professor Linda. Thank you for your good presentation. I have one question. Now in Chinese society, people become addicted to consuming. I mean, especially luxury goods.
Can you?
Consuming
Oh,
luxury goods.
Consuming,
okay. Yes.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, especially luxury goods. Does Linda think there is some hidden secrecy under this phenomenon? Is it also a part of high Chinese administration's policy which reacts to the globalization?
So consumerism in China,
Yeah, especially the
luxury goods, I think it's a very natural phenomenon. As China has opened up to the world, I like to say that no one in China can possibly not know how people in the cities live. Even in far-flung villages, there are 1 million villages, by the way, in China. There's a television. Many villages, people surf the internet. They see how people in the cities live, and the people in the cities certainly know how people in Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Sydney, anywhere in the world live. And everywhere in the world, people like to buy luxury goods. I don't think there's a hidden agenda. China has become a part of the world. And globalization has led to awareness of luxury goods. I don't think the Chinese government is promoting the sales of luxury goods. I think people want to buy them.
Okay.
The gentleman to along.
Hello, Linda. Thank you for this impressive tour de force around Chinese foreign policy. I'm wondering how you would characterise China's behaviour and decisions in the Security Council in relation to intervention in Syria.
That's a tough one. China, as a veto-wielding permanent member of the Security Council, never wants to be left alone. We've seen this time and again. It prefers to kind of take a bit of shield behind Russia's back, and it's not going to be a spoil breaker. I mean, we even saw this on Libya, that it wouldn't stand alone in opposition to what so-called the rest want or are striving toward. And I think that Syria poses an immense problem for the Chinese. Of course, Syria poses an immense problem for every single member of permanent member and any other member of the Security Council at the moment. So, but for Xi Jinping now as a new leader to be faced with even slightly deterring from this non-intervention policy, which is one of the principles of China's foreign policy, has been throughout the People's Republic of China, is going to be a really tough call. China is always worried that if they approve of intervening in the sovereign state somewhere, then that could be used against them. That's a fundamental anxiety that China has. And of course, we've seen many variations of China going around this. I'm not saying that, but it's going to be a real dilemma. And I probably, at this point in time, should have mentioned it as a fifth on my short-term challenges for China. And it's very difficult to predict.
Gentleman right up the back in the corner.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could give your views on China's current relationship with Russia and if you think that relationship is going to change in the foreseeable or predictable future.
That's a very important question. I just want to add one thing to the previous question, and this is this Syria dilemma that Xi Jinping is facing really reflects his desire not to have to think about foreign policy issues. I mean, this is really a typical issue which he hasn't probably been trained for. I mean, when I said that they have so much more foreign policy experience than their predecessors, this new 7 Politburo Standing Committee members, their experience in Africa, of course, the pivotal US neighboring countries and so on, but Syria is not something he's probably sat down and really put himself into. Now he's going to have to. And that's distracting him from what he really should be doing, wants to be doing, and that's making sure the economy grows. So this is another dilemma that Syria poses. China-Russia. I haven't really studied China-Russia in the last two years that I've been in Australia. My last report for CIPRI was about security and energy relations between China and Russia. And at the time, I very much was of the view that despite officially the two countries having the best relations ever, as we hear every time the leaders visit each other, there are immense tensions under the surface between Russia and China, starting from the fact that the little brother has now become the big brother and vice versa, centuries of antagonism, distrust. At the grassroots level, it's very difficult to get cultural, educational cooperation going because there seems to be an inherent dislike for each other among the peoples and so on and so forth. But having said that, I think in the last 2 years, China and Russia have both realized, even more so than before, that they really can be of some use to each other. So it is, as Borbolo has said, and I think he spoke here at ANU some weeks, if not months ago, it is an axis of convenience. It's not real trust, it's not real desire to have genuine cooperation, but they need each other. And I think we're going to see more of that in the near future. But in the long term, I really do not see them as partners. I really don't see them certainly as allies. They have conflicting interests at the end of the day.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 very brief questions to wrap up. The gentleman here with his hand up, and the gentleman down in front here.
Linda, thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask you your opinion on the future of the Sino-Indian relations, particularly with regards to Arunachal Pradesh and the Aksai Chin and those border disputes.
And we'll just take the gentleman down the front here. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. My name is Miki Omori from Japanese Embassy. And I first like to appreciate the very fair and comprehensive description of the situation surrounding Senkaku. It is of our interest to maintain status quo, but I don't want to argue right here. I like to I like to ask a question about the role of military, particularly PLA, in foreign policy decision making. We recently have had this incident where Chinese naval boat directed the targeting radar at Japanese naval boat, and we are not quite sure at which level such a decision has been made, and at what level Xi Jinping himself has control over military itself. Of course, he's a supreme leader of the military, but nowadays we've been hearing more and more quite assertive opinions from within ALP. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for both questions. I'm sorry to disappoint on the question of China-India. I said that no one knows anything about North Korea, and I'll stand by that, but China-India is a very rich topic, and it's something that I haven't studied throughout my career properly. The only thing I would like to comment about the recent tensions is that it is surprising to me that, as many observers before me have noted, that why is now China, when it's certainly, I think we're seeing signs of it trying to calm down its activities vis-à-vis the Southeast Asian nations. Why then the renewed tensions with India? That's a mystery for me. But the deeper China-India relations is not something that I've followed. And thank you also for the comments on Japan. I agree with you. Japan's intention is to keep the status quo. It's just the perception which is the problem. The role of the military in foreign policy decision-making, this is, of course, the real crux of understanding China's foreign policy formulation. It's something that we know far too little about, but what I have discovered studying these foreign policy actors, and certainly the PLA, I consider them a new foreign policy actor. I mean, they've always been an actor, but they're really trying to assert themselves into the role now. Of course they are. They want influence. And I think that's natural, but how much influence do they have is what we don't really know. There's certainly poor communication between the foreign affairs units of the military and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, it's an open secret in Beijing that the two absolutely don't get on with each other, and they hardly even communicate with each other. Generally speaking, the role and power of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has declined tremendously over the last 5 to 8 years. Though one Australian foreign policy official said that's the case in all countries. So the communication in this very stovepipe society is notoriously bad, specifically between the military and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who at least officially is supposed to coordinate foreign policy of civilian agencies. But there's also a disconnect, if I've understood Michael Swain, who I look upon as the world's leading expert on the PLA and decision-making within the PLA. Within the PLA, between this foreign affairs division, I'm calling it, it has a much more complicated name, and the ones who actually make strategy. So also within the PLA, there's not the best of communication of intention and then action, which could explain some of the miscommunications we have seen. As for this one specific incident about locking in the radar, I mean, no one knows who gave the command on that. But to your question, is Xi Jinping in command of the PLA? Yes, definitely. The PLA is the party's army. This is something that's in fact, I had some good discussions here in Canberra about this today with some of Australian senior officials. It's very difficult to comprehend that it's not a national army. It's something that many in China, by the way, advocate for, that the PLA would be China's national army and not the party's army. But the fact of the matter is, it is and will remain, as long as the party is in power, the party's army. And Xi Jinping couldn't be in power if he didn't control the army. And any reports that say anything to the contrary, I think, are very exaggerated. Xi Jinping does have one asset compared to his predecessors, and that's because he was brought up, as everyone knows, by a military family. He feels at home when he deals with generals. I mean, Hu Jintao in his first year, well, number one, Hu Jintao wasn't even head of the Central Military Commission during the first 2 years of being in power, but even despite that, when he went to visit army units, when he had discussions, when he had meetings, he couldn't have possibly felt as comfortable as Xi Jinping, who it's just very natural to have these generals around him. He has a lot of childhood friends among the senior ranks of the PLA. So I would say definitely he is in power. How much do they influence him? We don't know. I mean, I would be lying if I said I had even an inkling of how much they do influence him. But interaction he does have with the PLA much more than Hu Jintao did during his first year, right now at present. If you just look at his official program, he certainly has a lot of interaction with the PLA.